Hello and welcome to Maiden by the Matriarch. My guest today is Darel E. Paul. He's Professor of Political Science at Williams College and he's a specialist in the study of elite ideologies in the West. We spoke today about one such elite ideology, that is the LGBT rights movement, which has achieved an enormous amount since the early 1990s when Americans mostly expressed a lot of hostility to homosexuality. So we discussed Darel's book, From Toleration to Equality, which is about the political process by which the LGBT movement became mainstream. We also spoke about the changing meaning of marriage and how that paved the way for the introduction of same-sex marriage, why highly educated women are the most socially liberal group, and how the rainbow flag attains its cultural dominance, arguably becoming the alternative flag to the United States flag. The extended version of the episode is available, as always, at louiseperiod.substack.com, where you can find all of the other stuff associated with the podcast, the chat, the comments under the episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the live streams that I do sometimes with other Substackers, which you can either watch live and ask questions, or you can watch back later. I also need to remind you that there is a young adult version of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution coming out. It's abridged, so it's not only shorter, it also contains less of the grim stuff. The language is a bit simpler. It's basically designed to be read by young people aged about 15 to 17, maybe younger if you think that it would be appropriate for them. If you know someone who you think would appreciate reading it, please buy it for them. I would appreciate it too. Thank you. Darel, should we start by talking about your piece about drag for first things?
Yes,
which I thought was superb. I read it at the time and then I reread it because I knew that we would be speaking. And there's a lot in there, but I suppose should we start by talking about the stunning popularity of drag among liberal straight women as a cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, that I think was maybe it wasn't completely surprising to me, but I think the intensity of the interest was a bit shocking. Yeah, I wrote the piece, well, in part because the editor of First Things saw that this was kind of a strange cultural phenomenon and a political one, too. I mean, drag became this sign of political resistance to Donald Trump, and so it all seemed quite odd. And so I was kind of excited to dig into it and did lots of research. My kind of social science-y nature came out in that piece, so I spent a lot of time watching RuPaul, which I had never watched before. So I got an education that way as well. Yeah. And so I guess what I kind of came to conclude was that this was something that was certainly cultural. It was something about especially young straight women who saw in drag a certain kind of cultural phenomenon and association with feminism and gender expression and whatnot that they found really appealing. And then I think it got much broader because it was seen as a way to attack masculinity, and Donald Trump as being the signature symbol of, at least, over here we call it toxic masculinity. And so it was a way to attack Trump as well. So I think it served both of those purposes quite well.
I thought that was a really interesting insight, that the appeal of drag is not gender subversion as such, at least to these women. The appeal of drag is that it is anti-masculinity. I've not read that insight before, and I read it and I immediately thought, yes, that's true.
Yeah, I came to that conclusion because certainly the roots of drag are in anti-masculinity. I mean, gay men, it's very effeminate gay men who like drag, right? Masculine gay men don't engage in it and don't particularly enjoy it, as far as I could tell. And so it is an attempt to subvert masculinity by mocking it, to perform in a male body femaleness as a way to... The claim is not to mock femaleness or not to mock femininity, but to mock masculinity. Of course, I think what really happens is it winds up mocking femininity as well. But I think that most of the straight female consumers of drag don't see it that way. They see it only as this mocking of masculinity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think to some extent they're oblivious to the, slang like fishy or whatever. I think that a lot of the women who enjoy drag just don't really register it.
No, some of the stuff is really misogynistic in my opinion.
Yeah. Can I tell you a funny story? I went to a drag queen story hour.
Oh. Good for
A
you.
couple of years, no, let me go on. A couple of years ago, because I was sent by the Daily Mail, who I was working for at the time, and I brought my son, who I didn't feel too bad about bringing him because he was too young to know what was going on. He was only about 18 months. And it was held at a local park. And I went sort of, undercover to see what it's like, because it was a big deal in the UK at the time. We've, to some extent, imported this practice, habit, whatever, of women taking their children to drag queen story hour from the States. And the women there it was all mums bringing their kids. And they were all kind of, the small talk beforehand was all to do with, oh, all this right-wing media is so wound up about this, etc., etc. I obviously didn't mention why I was there. But the thing that I found so funny was that when the drag queen finally came out, right, having had a long prelude, which was basically just like a normal playgroup where we were just doing, like, the kids were playing with musical instruments and whatever, it was all completely benign. When the drag queen finally made their appearance, she was a woman, a real woman.
Mm.
She was a bio queen, right, who was dressed up in a kind of 1950s exaggerated housewife look with a big skirt and the tall hair and everything, and then basically did a musical singing, dancing kind of playgroup thing, which had really nothing to do with drag. And I thought, hang on, what's going on here? So this is just a completely normative playgroup run by and for a bunch of women, employing exaggerated feminine stereotypes, yes, but like there's actually nothing in this that has anything to do with gay drag culture, but all the women are here because they think it's subversive. It really made me laugh.
It's a safe kind of subversion, I
Well,
guess.
yeah, that's the thing. And actually, and it occurred to me that actually I think that particular children's playgroup company had just added Drag Queen Story Hour to its roster because it put bums on seats, and actually it otherwise had no interest in it. I think it was just sort of piggybacking off the media interest. So in that case, it was completely benign, and there wasn't anything inappropriate, or vulgar, or sexualized, or anything. But it clearly is the case that lots of liberal women are drawn to bringing their children to these events, despite, or perhaps because of, the sexualization and vulgarity.
Which is so odd,
Yeah.
I guess. So some of the events that I looked into in writing that piece were not just the playgroups and the story times, which tend to be held in pretty normal, shall we say, places, libraries, parks, whatever it might be, by people who were widely considered to be quite unthreatening librarians. But others were not. Others were in gay bars with the certain kinds of advertising and slogans on the walls that one might associate with such places, and the kinds of women who were bringing their children there. They did not, at least from the videos that I had watched, didn't seem to take offense to any of it, and really encouraged their children to go up and to interact with the drag queens, sometimes even giving them money, which is a very odd cultural phenomenon, I think, which really kind of cried out for some kind of explanation.
What explanation did you come to?
The part I think about young women, these obviously tend to be childless women. I think they're going to the clubs, they're enjoying drag, they're watching RuPaul. Women like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, in the United States, who is a very, very big public fan of drag. I think they're doing this for reasons that are a bit different from the mothers who are taking their young children. I think the young single women are doing it because of its association with gender and this kind of dismantling of masculinity. Whereas I think there's more of a kind of a political intent, but not a particularly strong one. I think it's a political intent to say, I'm a liberal person. I have the right kinds of thoughts. I know what's the right thing to think about, because the term might be on the left, sexual minorities. And so it's a way to show a certain kind of social solidarity. But in similar ways as it is, putting up a sign in your yard saying, I stand with Ukraine. It's very nice. It's a nice sentiment, and it costs absolutely nothing.
I find it tiresome personally, but I'm not a joiner-inner. Generally, I don't put things up in my front window or my yard if I had one. Yeah, so AOC is a really interesting example of this, because AOC's boyfriend or husband, I don't know if they're married, but he's really very conventionally masculine.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I didn't look a whole lot into him and what he was like and the kinds of things he said, but I did read a good amount about what she thought of him and how she spoke of him. And there was a whole section where she's discussing his willingness to go to therapy and work on their relationship, and especially how difficult it must be for him, being sort of a normie, to be married to a woman like her, kind of a strong, independent woman. And I think there is this therapeutic dimension as well, which kind of winds up being in a lot of my writing. I think just because I really do believe that this therapeutic orientation, which you could call a religion, I certainly do. I think I'm happy to call it that, a therapeutic religion, really is the faith of the American professional class, and I suspect across the Anglosphere, and that American culture just seems to kind of reach its tentacles everywhere.
A paradox that you identify in the drag piece is that drag is simultaneously deliberately fake and also seen to be a route by which to access the authentic.
Which seems contradictory, of course.
Yeah.
But I just couldn't help but come to that conclusion. It's meant to be fake, right? It's meant to be over the top. It's meant, at least in the older forms of drag, we're meant to know that these are men. Mm-hmm. Although, as you noted, increasingly you actually have biological women who are doing drag, and right, RuPaul has them on his show now. But then at the same time, there is this deeply therapeutic aspect to, I think you can very much see it in the RuPaul show, RuPaul Drag Race, that by doing drag, by engaging in camp, you somehow are not being ironic, but you're being your true self. And it's hard to know exactly how to react to that contradiction. I guess what I mostly wanted to do in the piece was just to show it to readers and to say that this is going on. It may be, though, simply because the therapeutic is so important in American culture, and I think especially on the left, that everything tends to work through a therapeutic kind of language. So why does one do anything in life? Well, to access or develop or discover the true self. And so there are those moments in RuPaul's Drag Race where the contestants have these moments of therapeutic intervention and thinking about themselves when they were children and what they would say to their younger selves. And it's all supposed to be very emotional and tear-jerking. And so to say that through camp, through the fake, I access the real, is just simply what they're saying. And I guess we can make of it what we can.
And it's a beautiful insight into exactly that. Yeah, that cultural view. You also in that piece write about Susan Sontag's writing on camp. Could you explain her view? Because it's a very interesting one.
So Sontag writes on camp, way back in the 60s, if I remember right. And she's reflecting on camp in a period before the normalization of homosexuality. So for her, camp is this exaggeration of masculinity and this exaggeration of femininity, but it's mostly performed by men exaggerating masculinity and women exaggerating femininity. And certainly this comes afterwards, but I would say, at least in my own generation, so I grew up mostly in the 80s, Arnold Schwarzenegger would be a great example of this kind of camp masculinity, right? The uber male with the giant muscles, can barely speak, all of these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And yet, of course, what happens over time is, and Sontag even talks about this a little bit in her piece in the 60s, that gay men seem to be particularly interested and particularly attracted to camp, and that it is intentionally, fake is not quite the right word, because I don't think that really captures the cultural meaning of camp. It's meant to, so the example that I'll give you is the one that I use in the piece that I think expresses it best. It's the difference between beauty and glamour. Glamour is camp, right? It is lots and lots of makeup. It is hair that is done up in kind of extravagant and perhaps even ridiculous ways. It's exceptionally long fingernails, whatever that might be in terms of glamour. But it's not meant to be beautiful if we think of beauty as being somehow tied to the natural. Glamour is meant to be non-natural. And camp, this is Sontag's argument, is meant to be distant from nature. And in fact, anything that is natural can't be camp. They have to be separated. That's kind of the essence, in her view, of what camp is. And so I think exactly why cross-dressing or drag, and now certainly transgenderism and its expressions are particularly suited towards camp and this kind of cultural expression.
Does camp also have to be humorous to some extent, or at least non-serious?
I think it is supposed to be, and certainly originally it was, because it's, I guess, certainly when Sontag is writing, I think camp is more good-natured, shall we say? It's meant to mock, but you're mocking yourself in some way, right? It's men who were mocking masculinity. It's women who are mocking femininity, but at the same time, they still associate with it. When gay men really begin to kind of take over much of camp, I think it turns away from a lot of that good-naturedness, because it is meant to mock masculinity, and it is a rejection of it. We are not masculine men. We despise masculinity. And if you want evidence for that, just listen to what RuPaul himself has said about drag. That's what it is for him. And so I think that's also part of the reason why you don't see the kind of uber masculine form of camp. You don't see much of that anymore. I think it's faded away quite a lot. You do see a bit of it on the female side, but I think camp has just become so associated with gay men that it might have kind of sucked up all of this cultural oxygen and brought it into what, we would call drag now. And so there is certainly a humorous element, right? There are jokes, but it depends on your values. It depends on your form of humor, but some of those jokes I don't find particularly funny, but others do.
I'm surprised to hear that camp has ever not been associated with gay men, but that kind of makes sense now, of a Simpsons episode, which you may recall, where Homer becomes friendly with a man who runs a local shop selling kind of knickknacks, and he's really into camp, and his shop sells camp stuff, and he loves camp clothing and whatever, and Homer just thinks he's really fun. And over the course of the episode, everyone except Homer comes to realise that this guy is obviously gay, and the penny doesn't drop until much later in the piece. And then anyway, it's all very funny, but that kind of makes sense now if camp has not always been inextricably linked to homosexuality.
I think especially thinking about the cultural acceptance of homosexuality. If you go back to the 50s and the 60s, it's much more suppressed. And so I think there's lots of gay men obviously doing camp, but it's a bit underground. If it's going to be in mainstream media and films, for example, it's not going to be very obvious. And so I think a lot of that is more an expression of where the wider cultural values are at the time. And so obviously as homosexuality has become normalized over the last 40, 50 years, I think it's that association, which I think was always there nascently. It's just become a lot stronger.
Which brings us on to the book of yours that I particularly want to speak about today, on the process by which it's a very social sciencey book, admirably so. There's lots of quantifiable data in there. It's great, but it's about exactly this process of homosexuality becoming normalized from the mid-20th century onwards. I mean, do you want to kind of start by summarizing your thesis, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty?
The first cut of the thesis is the subtitle of the book, which is How Elites Brought America to Same-Sex Marriage. It's you're right, it's a very social sciencey book. It's rooted in a class analysis. I guess you can see some of my lefty roots there from back in the day, that I think the reason why homosexuality became normalized in America, which I suppose for young people might be a little hard to conceive, because the transformation has been so tremendous, even just from the 1980s to really the 2000s. And I think it is a process of elites adopting this. And by elites, I mean especially professionals, the professional class, but also managers and the managerial class, which is probably, 20-ish, 25% maybe of the American population in terms of households. Might be a little bit less in some other Western countries. We have a very big professional class here. And they adopted this as a cultural value, a cultural expression, and I think they adopted it for political reasons as well. It turned out to be quite politically useful for professionals and the left in America, which I think are mostly the same people, to advance their political agenda.
Could you expand on that, the political utility of this?
Sure. So The way I put it in the book is maybe a bit crass, but it's a useful stick with which to beat your enemies. And certainly in the 1990s and the 2000s, the enemies were cultural conservatives. I mean, I think they're still enemies today, but there's just not that many cultural conservatives in America. And what count now, at least, maybe from the perspective of Britain, it looks like there's a lot of them. But from how many there used to be 20 years ago, there's a lot fewer. For example, you'll see lots of Republicans now who are happy to identify as Republicans, vote Republican, but they're not particularly conservative when it comes to cultural issues. Anyhow, the kind of prominence of cultural conservatives in the 90s and the 2000s was such that same-sex marriage and homosexuality in general was a really nice, distinguishing cultural marker. We, the left, were for it because we know that the right is against it. Of course, everybody was against it in the 1980s. You can see that in the polling. But things begin to change in the early 1990s, and they kind of transform all throughout the period after the early 90s. And so the left uses homosexuality as a cultural marker of difference and a highly moralized marker of difference to say, we are good and you are bad. And I think it's largely effective over time, right? It takes a while. It takes probably 15 or so, maybe 20 years to unfold. But by the end of that period, it's pretty successful, I think. I think the evidence shows it.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Yeah, the thing that you outline very persuasively is the way that it is top down. 2 other possible theories, neither of which work, I think. One is that it was entirely a consequence of a kind of moral awakening across society, where people encountered gay men and women in their lives or through media or whatever, and experienced a kind of moment of conversion, and that this happened in a very widespread and non-class stratified way from the 90s onwards. Okay, that would be one theory. I think you make it very clear that that's not the case, that you do see this really trickling down the class hierarchy very distinctly. Another might be that the homophobes died off, and that the new generation had just never been exposed to homophobic ideas, perhaps, and so they didn't imbibe them from a young age. And there's probably more truth to that latter story, but I think it is clear from your data that actually people changed their minds, and quickly.
I think so. So I'm happy to address both of those. The first one in the social sciences is usually called the contact hypothesis, right? That people who don't know another group of people have negative views of them, but as soon as they get to know them, they have social interactions with them, they change their minds. They see that, oh, they're just like me. And so therefore the polling data will change a lot through contact. I think it's just false. The evidence for it is very, very weak. And there's lots of counterexamples. And one of the counterexamples that I talk about, especially in terms of toleration, which is kind of a big theme around homosexuality, certainly in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, is that there are lots of people that the left very much doesn't like, and they don't become more tolerant. They don't become more tolerant of people that they call Christian fundamentalists. That tends to be the term that's used in polling. And so I think the contact hypothesis just doesn't have any good evidence behind it. And certainly if anybody wanted to challenge me, they'd go go read the sections of the book where I talk about it. The second, I think you're right. The generational change, I think that does have some validity. The problem with the generational change argument, though, is that if you look at the data, the polling data, there are very clear breakpoints. Things are very, very stable all throughout the 70s, the 80s especially, and it's very negative towards homosexuality in the 80s until the very early 90s, and then something happens. It's almost like a dam breaks, and you can just see the lines of opposition begin to just crash and fall. That can't be a generational change in something that happens over the course of 5 or 10 years. And so there is a dramatic cultural change going on. And so some of the things I talk about in the book are the changing view of the media and the prominence of gay characters in lots of television shows, the way that the major newspapers treat homosexuality and same-sex couples, and then also the importance of the professions. You see some real transformations in psychiatry and psychology. You see it in the law. You see it, as I said, in media, and you see it in religious organizations too, which might not be super powerful and super important, but I think they set, at least they certainly try to set a moral tone to cultural conversations, and all of what, at least in the U.S., we call the mainstream, or mainline Protestants, they began turning pretty quickly over to normalization in the 90s and the 2000s.
What do you think was the role of AIDS in triggering that? Because the timing does seem very suggestive that it's immediately post the peak of the AIDS crisis that you see this big shift.
It's interesting because in the early period of AIDS, this makes people more negative towards homosexuality, and especially, obviously, gay men. And so if you look at opinions in the kind of early and mid-70s, right, when the sexual revolution and kind of the gay rights movement first starts getting going, it's not as negative as it is in the late 70s and throughout the 1980s. So I think the initial reaction is negative. Mm-hmm. This makes people think more poorly of homosexuality. Mm. And so I personally don't think that AIDS plays a very big role, except I will say this, that when the media begins to talk about AIDS as an everyman's disease, I think that begins to change some of the sentiment. And so there is a hemophiliac boy in the early 1990s, I believe, Ryan White. I think he's even from Indiana, kind of this good, wholesome Midwestern state, right, where all the conservative people live and they think the right thoughts. And he's kind of stigmatized, he's ostracized because he has AIDS, which he contracted from blood transfusions, and the media begins to play this up a lot. And I think that begins to change some people's minds about AIDS. That it's not that AIDS connection to homosexuality changes their minds, is that when it becomes detached from homosexuality, that people begin to change their minds a bit about AIDS. And I think that opens up some space for different kinds of thoughts about homosexuality.
I did an episode with Niccolo Soldo some time ago about the early history of AIDS, because he went into the archives and looked at contemporary sources, like lots and lots of contemporary sources, because a lot of stuff was preserved from medical authorities and men who contracted AIDS and were involved in the gay scene and so on. The history is quite shocking, not because it's horrible, although it is horrible. I mean, it's a terrible disease, but because the conventional narrative on it is so wrong. It's quite shockingly wrong. Well, I'd say that the conventional narrative around, the progressive narrative around it now, is that it was a disease that kind of sprung out of nowhere. And the fact that some people would say that the disproportionate impact on gay men was not all that disproportionate, that it affects everyone, people of all genders, sexually assault people of all genders get AIDS, right? And those that would acknowledge the disproportionality would say that it was, I don't know, either a fluke or to do with gay men not having access to healthcare or something like that. And then that Reagan's reluctance to even talk about AIDS publicly for a long time was a consequence of homophobia, and that led to more deaths. There's a whole story around it, which Reagan was reluctant to talk about it, but the truth is that the reason that the AIDS epidemic happened was because of incredibly high levels of promiscuity within gay villages in the US, and it was downstream of post-gay liberation, men congregating in these places and having like enormous numbers of sexual partners. And this was exactly why it became this super, super lethal epidemic. And it is still the case, at least in Western countries outside of Africa, that it's overwhelmingly a disease that affects gay men. And all of this is, I don't know, it's not quite taboo. I mean, this information is out there. Like Randy Schultz wrote about this very openly in And the Band Played On, right? It's not
But
hidden.
nice people are not supposed to mention things like this.
No, they're not. They're not. And when I released that episode, I did get quite a lot of listeners saying like, wow, I didn't know, I didn't know any of that, which is why it is curious that you have this wave of acceptance that comes immediately after an epidemic that actually could have highlighted the differences actually between gay culture and straight culture. And yet kind of ended up doing the opposite. We had the kind of will and gracification.
Yes. And you saw it in Friends as well. Not as prominent in Friends, but obviously it's there from the very beginning. And these are shows that are coming online in the early 90s. Yeah. This is when you see this tremendous break in the opinion data. Something happens in the early 90s, and it's a very big change in how just kind of regular everyday people begin to look at homosexuality. But to get back to where we were a couple of minutes ago, it is very class stratified. It starts with elites. It starts with the professional class in the places, the parts of America where they are most concentrated. And I think that's important because it means that it's the places where they're hegemonic. They don't have to listen to other people. They don't have to care very much about what working class people or middle class people think about things because there's so many of them. And that's New England, in the Northeast in particular, and to some extent the West Coast. And it spreads from there. It's professionals in those places. It spreads to managers, the managerial class. A lot of these classes are intertwined through things like marriage. And then it spreads down the class hierarchy until it finally kind of reaches the working class. But even today, I think in America, the working class is not nearly as accepting of homosexuality as elites are. Elites are very, very positive towards it.
What do you think was the role of dechristianization in triggering this elite response?
I think a big role, because I don't think the left thought of it so much as dechristianization, but they certainly thought of it as an important means to undermine, I guess, what they might call conservative Christianity or fundamentalism. And these are words that were used freely and openly. Right? This is very much the intent. The kinds of things that Vice President Dan Quayle represented in the early 90s, or televangelists, which were much more prominent in the 90s than certainly they are today. And so I think it was, very much a cultural project to undermine those kinds of institutions and those kinds of values, aided, of course, by lots of Christians, because there were lots of mainline Protestants who were also very opposed, identify themselves as opposed to other Christians. So, for example, the local Congregationalist church here in my town always celebrates January 6th. Why do they celebrate January 6th? Because it is their opportunity to protest against what they call Christian nationalism. Their primary enemies are other Christians who have the wrong kinds of political views. So there's lots of different people who were aiding in this bigger cultural and political project.
See, that Christian response is the more mysterious one, because you can understand why people who have been very secularized, which of course is happening concurrently with all of this, church attendance is dropping, all this stuff is happening at the same time. Very secularized people, you can see why they would latch on to gay rights as a stick with which to beat their enemies, as we've talked about already. It's more mysterious why some churches would embrace this. I mean, yes, I guess a stick with which to beat other denominations. Christians love doing that. But it does still seem like quite a significant departure from the historic church teachings.
I think it's because they're elites, and they're elites first. So one of the tables I have in the book is a documentation of the income levels and educational levels, on average, for various American denominations, not just Christians, but also some non-Christians too. And there is a pretty good correlation between the degree to which a particular denomination is full of elites, by which I'd say rich people and people with higher education, lots of higher education, and their acceptance of homosexuality, or I'd say their normalization of homosexuality in their own churches, in terms of allowing partnered gay people to be ministers on the one hand, and then on the other to approve of same-sex couples through ceremonies. After a certain time, obviously, marriage itself. And those are highly associated with being elites. So this is Reform Jews, this is Episcopalians, this is Presbyterians in the U.S. They're a very elite status, and so they absorb elite views. I think the fact that they're Christians is not super important to this story, although the institution that they express those values through are churches.
I have long had a theory, and I don't know whether it's possible to combine this with the elite theory, one that you're positing, that one of the reasons for this incredible movement we're describing of people becoming much, much more tolerant of homosexuality in a really short period of time is feminization of institutions. That I think that women, I mean, there is research, including research which monitors people's physiological responses to images of gay and lesbian people, i.e. completely unconscious responses. There is research demonstrating that men are a lot more homophobic than women are. And I wonder whether the influx of women into public life, which really is a 1990s phenomenon. I mean, it starts in the 60s and 70s, but it doesn't really get going. I mean, you look at the proportion of mothers who are working outside the home, and really it's a 1990s onwards thing. I wonder if it's that actually which mostly explains at least the institutional shifts towards being less homophobic in media and even in churches. That's also the period where you start having women in positions of leadership in churches more frequently. One, do you think that might be persuasive? And two, how might that fit with what we clearly see with the top-down process that you describe?
Certainly the most culturally liberal people, I guess I define that as, views on homosexuality, views on immigration, views on, the death penalty and crime and punishment, all these kinds of things. The most liberal people in America certainly are highly educated women.
Yeah.
Hands down. And so I think you're right that it's not coincidental that the normalization processes come through fields that tend to have a lot of highly educated women in them, especially mental health professions, right, which are very, very female dominated. And obviously not so much in the 70s and 80s, but when they kind of come to accept normalization. But over time, one of the things I note in the drag queens piece is that librarians are overwhelmingly female. And so I think it's, again, no coincidence that you have institutions that are dominated by highly educated women, tend to be very, very friendly towards, or if you want to be more social sciencey, kind of more normalized or promote a normalization project. I guess the larger question then is why? I think the data is very strong on this, but the larger question is why would that be the case? And so that's a good question, and I think an important one. I suspect that when men, I'll just say this on average, right? When men think of homosexuality, I think they're going to think of sexual behavior much more so than women. And I think women are going, when they think of homosexuality, they're going to think of emotions, practices of camaraderie and social support and whatnot. And I think that's going to be part of the explanation. But I think there's a larger cultural one. Yeah, I think there's just a larger cultural one too, that it's not just women overall, although it's true, but especially elite women. So there's kind of the gender stuff, and then there's also the class stuff. And I think those two together really enhance this correlation.
I find the gender stuff less mysterious than the class stuff, because the gender stuff could be linked to, I don't quite know what the explanation is, but it is possible that there's an evolutionary explanation for why men are more homophobic than women. There have been various ideas posited by different evolutionary psychologists as to why men might have more of an aversion to gay sex. The education one is more curious to me, because you can see how once educational institutions become extremely progressive, how that would then reproduce itself. So people who are then going through those institutions imbibe those ideas. I'm curious though about how that gets going. Like, why is it that highly educated people are the first to cotton onto this. Historically, that hasn't always been the case. There have been plenty of examples of educational institutions being bulwarks of conservatism, and
Yes.
particularly religious conservatism. And yet that falls away quite suddenly. I mean, I suppose you might say, some people would say, that this is actually about people being high IQ, and that high IQ correlates with the personality trait openness to experience. Not exactly, but there is a correlation. And maybe basically smarter people genuinely are more open-minded, genuinely are less big. I mean, that's a kind of, it's a slightly self-serving story from people who are themselves, well, who might think of themselves as being both very intelligent and very open-minded. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some truth to that. It seems like a somewhat inadequate explanation, though, given how rapidly we see this shift happen.
I think that's exactly right. Your last comment, Louise, that even though all that is true, and you can see in surveys, social science studies, that people with higher IQ tend to be more liberal, and especially on these kinds of cultural issues. They don't tend to be particularly liberal on economic issues. They're not they're not communists, but they certainly are very left on cultural matters. Yeah, I think this, if you want to call it openness to experience, you can call it values of cultural creativity. Those are very much associated with elites in this country. I think a lot of that is because our economy has changed so much. Right? We're not a manufacturing-oriented economy. It's a services-oriented economy, and especially in the United States, where so much of the economic, cultural, political power of the country comes from technological innovation. You see people in the tech sector also being very, very liberal on matters of sexuality, and they're important pioneers in the corporate sphere in terms of normalizing homosexuality. I think that the class dimension is partly there in these kinds of very large transformations in our economy that have happened over the last 50 years or so. I think there's also some very big transformations in the family. And so one of the arguments I have in the book is that this is kind of the more provocative version of it, but that's good for podcasts. That elites in America were already gay married, and so why wouldn't they support same-sex marriage? That is, they were people who delayed marriage. They didn't get married early. They didn't get married when, I understand because I've listened to lots and lots of your podcasts, they didn't get married early, like people like you and I did, in their mid-20s, which is like crazy talk nowadays, I guess.
Yeah, historically it's not that early.
No.
Yeah, but yeah, it is now.
They delay marriage, especially after education. They delay childbirth to quite late. They are very progressive, if you want to use that language, on sexuality and sexual expression. But even though sex before marriage, sex in non-standard, if you will, forms of sex are fine, they should always be safe, of course. And so therefore that means they shouldn't result in pregnancy. But if they do, unfortunately, right, it's always certainly perfectly fine to have abortions. That mode, a very low fertility, companionate understanding of marriage that's not fundamentally rooted in children, that's in the book, I call it the blue family model. Blue because that's the color that liberals in the Democratic Party have in the United States. And that's already a form of family that's very easy to incorporate same-sex couples into, right? You only have children when you mean to. You never have them by accident. You wait until you're quite old to have them. Everything is very planned and intentional, and it's very much a practice of elites, which at least coupled gay men and lesbians in America are inordinately of a higher class status. Single gay men and lesbians are not, but the coupled ones are. Maybe that's just partly because couples in general tend to have higher status than single people do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the transformation of marriage happened first. And then once that transformation had happened, it seemed illogical to not extend it.
Yeah, I think they couldn't think of any reasons why not to. If marriage doesn't really have anything to do, or nothing necessarily to do with sexual difference and reproduction, then yeah, why not?
Yeah. So gay marriage happened because the pill was invented.
I think technology is an important part of this story. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Maybe not a direct line, but yeah, the line's there.
Yeah. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And indeed, part of the reason why you end up with the influx of women into public life is also because the pill was invented. Go
Sure.
back to my favorite kind of inflection point in the historical record. Yes, I think that severing of marriage from reproduction is a really remarkable historical event, actually, because I think it's something that other cultures historically or in other parts of the world find very perplexing. Why would we not see those two things as the same? Like, the purpose of marriage is to reproduce. And yes, there will be instances where people can't. There will be infertility, whatever. But that's what it's for. I reminded actually of my grandmother recently, who is actually a very, generally quite a liberal person, but she is also in her late 80s, so she has different cultural assumptions to other people. And she was commenting on a couple in her retirement village who had got married as elderly people, I think widowed, and a widow and a widower. And she said something like, "What's the point?" And it was a curious. It kind of made me laugh, and it was a curious comment because what she was doing there was honing in on this historical understanding of marriage, which when she got married in the late 50s was obvious that the purpose of marriage is reproduction, and therefore why would elderly people get married? Yeah, that's not a sentiment that you hear often now, but it's indicative, I think, of that change.
The United States and Western countries, right, have for a long time had somewhat different marriage norms from most of the rest of the world. I'll certainly say in Eurasia and Africa, right, where universal marriage for women, right, not for men. Too many men, right? Some of those will never get married, but all the women must get married. That was standard practice from the earliest periods that I think we have any knowledge of down into really the 20th century. A little bit different in the West, right? Because in the West, there were always, at least relatively speaking, rather high numbers of women who would not marry, some 10 to maybe even 20%, depending on the country and the period. And there were some periods in which, I guess, right, the term that nobody uses anymore, but used to be back in the day, right, illegitimate children born outside of marriage. Sometimes those numbers would get rather high, but they were never normative. And now they are. You look at a country like Norway, you look at a country like France, where it's not just a majority of the children are born outside of marriage, but the overwhelming majority are born outside of marriage. It does kind of make one wonder, why do people get married at all then anymore? And certainly in the United States, I think there's a prestige factor, right? People will get married because it's prestigious to be married. And I think it's prestigious to be married because it says that you're a successful person. You have done a difficult thing, which is to attract and hold a mate. That's no easy task. And so you marry that person, that means, look, I'm high status. Even if you're, working class, that can still be a marker of status. But I'm not quite sure why in places like Norway and France, anybody gets married anymore. And I guess increasingly they don't. And that's the larger point.
To have a big party.
Perhaps to have a party. I guess there are some people, maybe it's fading away, that have some kind of religious or religious-like sentiments. And so therefore they think, well, now that, we've been together for 30 years and we have 2 children, let's get married. Maybe there's that kind of thing that goes on. I think the marriage culture, though, in the U.S. is quite different from something like France and Norway. So it's a little bit harder, I think, to explain marriage in those places versus here in America.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.